Welcome back to Calm Art Studio. In this episode, we arrive in a small village in Normandy where Claude Monet found something he had been searching for. Not just new subjects to paint, but a place to remain. Giverny would become more than a home. It would become a world he shaped with intention. A garden arranged by color and season. A pond designed to hold light. A bridge curved gently over water. A space where reflection and reality could meet. Here, Monet would begin to slow his movements through the world. He would return to the same view again and again. He would paint, not objects, but moments. Not things, but the way light rests on them. If you enjoy slow art history told in a calm and reflective way, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel and join this growing community. You can also share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every message, and I'm always grateful to hear how these stories are meeting you. Now, let's step into Giverny. Let's walk through the pink house with green shutters and begin. He found a house to rent. It was not a grand house. It was substantial but modest. A farmhouse, really, built in a local style. What made it particular was its color. The exterior walls were painted pink. Not a bright pink, but a warm, muted tone, something between rose and terracotta. The shutters were green. This combination, pink and green, gave the house a gentle appearance, something welcoming, something that did not demand attention, but simply sat comfortably within its surroundings. The house had space. Rooms for living, rooms for working, rooms for a family. And Monet was not alone. He came to Giverny with Alice Hochet and her children. Alice had 6 children of her own. Monet had 2 sons. Together they formed a household of many people, a blended family, though the term did not exist then, in the way it would later. They were simply people who had come together, who shared a home, who made a life in common. Alice's husband, Ernest Hochet, had suffered bankruptcy some years earlier. The financial collapse had rearranged everything. For a time, the 2 families had shared a house in Vetoy, a town further along the Seine. It had been a difficult arrangement, born of necessity. But over time, Alice had taken on the care of Monet's 2 sons, alongside her own children. She had become the steady presence in the household, the one who managed the daily routines, the meals, the needs of so many young people. When Monet moved to Giverny, Alice came with him. The village was small enough that everyone would have noticed the arrival of such a large household. A painter from Paris. A woman with 6 children. 2 young boys added to the group. It was not scandalous, exactly. People in small villages had seen stranger arrangements. But it was certainly noticed. And, over time, the village grew accustomed to them. The painter in the pink house. The family that came and went through the green shutters. The sound of children playing in the garden. For Monet, Giverny represented a kind of relief. He had spent so many years in motion, moving when money ran out, moving when a landlord needed the house back, moving to find new subjects to paint, new light, new weather. The constant movement had been exhausting. It had made it difficult to plan, difficult to build anything stable, difficult to think beyond the immediate needs of the next week or month. But now, There was a house, a place that could be arranged, could be made into something, could become familiar through long use. There was land around the house. Not a vast estate, but enough. Gardens. Space for children to run. Space for quiet. The rooms inside were simple at first. The house had not been built for a painter. It had been a farmhouse, meant for agricultural life, for the practical needs of people who worked the land. But Monet began to make it his own. Slowly, over time. He thought about color, even in the interiors. He thought about how rooms would feel, how light would move through them during different hours of the day. One of the first rooms you would enter was the blue sitting room. It was a modest space, meant for welcoming guests, for family gatherings. Monet chose cool blue tones for this room. It was a deliberate choice. The rest of the house had warmer colors, yellows and pinks, but the blue sitting room was calm, a place where the eye could rest. Alice and the children used this room. They would sit there in the afternoons. They would gather there when visitors came, which was not often. Giverny was far from Paris. It took effort to reach. And so the house remained mostly private, mostly for the family. There was a dining room as well. Monet had the walls painted in two vivid yellows. The furniture was yellow too. Against this warmth, he placed blue crockery. Near the dining room was the kitchen, painted blue, a shade that would harmonize when the door between them stood open. These were not grand statements. They were the choices of someone thinking about how a house should feel. Monet had spent his life looking at color outdoors. Now he was bringing that understanding indoors, into the spaces where the family would spend their time. The daily rhythm began to establish itself. Monet kept a routine. He would rise at dawn. He would take a cold bath. This was his habit, a way of waking fully. He would drink a glass of white wine, even in the morning. Then he would go out to paint. By 11:30, he would return for lunch. Meals happened at specific times. Lunch at 11:30. Dinner at 7. Lateness was frowned upon. Before lunch, there would be an aperitif. Plum brandy. A small glass. The children would come in from wherever they had been playing. The household would assemble in the bright yellow dining room. They kept poultry. Chickens for eggs and meat. There was a kitchen garden with vegetables and herbs. In autumn, Monet would go with Alice and the children to gather mushrooms. They would walk through the nearby woods, looking for mushrooms growing in the shade, under trees, in the damp places where they thrived. It was a quiet activity, something that required patience and attention, and it brought them together, moving slowly through the landscape, searching, finding, gathering. The food on the table came from this place. From the ground they walked on. From the garden they tended. It was not elaborate. It was honest food, prepared simply, but it connected them to Giverny in a direct way. They were not just living here, they were part of the place. They were eating what grew here. They were participating in the seasons, in the cycles of planting and harvest. Alice managed all of this. She organized the household. She made sure the children were cared for, that meals happened on time, that the house ran smoothly, despite its size and complexity. She did not paint. She did not seek attention. She was simply there, steady, reliable, the center around which the household revolved. Without her, Monet could not have worked as he did. He understood this.
He relied on her completely.
The children grew accustomed to Giverny. They learned the village. They walked its lanes. They knew which paths led to the river. They knew where the best mushrooms grew. They knew the neighbors, the shopkeepers, the rhythms of village life. For Monet's two sons, this was different from the previous years of moving, of temporary homes, of uncertainty. Now there was a house they could return to. A village they knew. A life that felt, if not permanent, at least more stable than what had come before. For Alice's children, it was a continuation of what had already begun in Vethwell. They had been living with Monet for years by this point. The arrangement was familiar. But Giverny was different because it felt more intentional. This was not a shared house born of crisis. This was a choice, a place chosen deliberately, rented with the idea that it might become something more than just another temporary stop. Over time, Monet began to think about the land around the house. There was space for a garden. Not just a vegetable garden, though that remained important, but a flower garden. Something he could shape, something he could tend, something that would give him subjects to paint without having to travel far from home. He was older now. Not old, but no longer young. The years of constant travel, of painting in all weather, of financial struggle, had taken something from him. He was tired in a way he had not been in his 20s and 30s. The idea of having a garden, of being able to walk a few steps from his door and find something worth painting, was appealing. It would save time. It would save energy. And it would allow him to observe the same place over and over, to see how it changed with the seasons, with the weather. But in those first months, the garden was still just an idea. The land was there. The house was there. The family was settling in. But the transformation of the place, the work that would turn Giverny into something particular, something entirely his own, that had not yet begun. For now, it was enough to be in one place, to unpack, to arrange furniture, to establish routines, to let the children claim their rooms, to learn where the light entered the windows at different times of day, to begin the slow process of making a house feel like home. Monet painted as he always did. He went out with his easel and his canvases. He painted the fields around Giverny. He painted the river. He painted the village itself from various angles at various times of day. He was learning the place through his eyes, through the act of painting it, seeing how it revealed itself in different conditions. The work was steady, not rushed. He had time now. He did not have to leave in a month or 6 months. He could return to the same spot again and again. He could watch what happened when winter turned to spring, when summer faded into autumn. He could begin to know a place the way he had known Le Havre as a boy, through long familiarity, through patient observation. Alice was there when he returned. The house was there. The children were there. The meals happened at their appointed times. The household functioned in. It was simple, but it was reliable. And reliability, after so many years of instability, was itself a kind of gift. In the evenings, after dinner, the house would grow quiet. The children would settle. Alice would manage the small tasks of the day. Monet would sit, sometimes looking at what he had painted, sometimes just resting. Outside, the village was dark. On clear nights, you could see the stars. The air was clean. The sounds were different. A dog barking. The wind through trees. The small sounds of the house settling. This was the life that was beginning. Quiet. Domestic. Rooted in one place. It was not dramatic. But there was a sense of something new, of a chapter opening, of a man arriving somewhere he might finally remain. The house, with its pink walls, stood in the village. The green shutters opened each morning and closed each evening. The family moved through the rooms. The routines repeated. And, slowly, Giverny began to feel less like a place they had come to and more like a place they belonged. Monet was beginning to settle. He would still travel to paint. But now there was a place to return to. A house that waited. A family that remained. And the land itself waited. The garden that did not yet exist. The ground that had not yet been touched. The transformation that would come, slowly, over the years ahead. The land around the house was not wild, but it was practical. When Monet first arrived, the ground was used as farmland, had always used ground. There were vegetables growing in rows. Useful plants. Things meant to feed a household. The space served a purpose, but it was not the purpose Monet had in mind. He began to change it. He did not change everything at once. This was not a sudden transformation. It happened slowly, over months, over seasons. He would look at a section of the garden and decide what it might become. Then he would work. Digging. Planting. Removing what was there and replacing it with something else. The vegetables began to disappear. Not all of them. The kitchen garden remained. Alice still needed herbs and vegetables for the household. The practical needs of feeding so many people did not go away simply because Monet wanted flowers. But the balance shifted. Where there had been rows of cabbages, there would now be something else. Where there had been practical, orderly plots, there would now be color. Monet planted flowers. He did not plant them randomly. He did not scatter seeds and hope for the best. He thought about where each plant would go. He thought about how colors would sit next to each other. He thought about height, about texture, about the way different plants would bloom at different times, creating a sequence of color that would move through the seasons. He planted in large groups, dense stands of a single flower. Not one iris here and another there, but many together. A mass of color. A concentration. He planted ribbons of nasturtiums that would flow through the garden like water. He planted sunflowers in groups, tall and bright. He planted dahlias clustered together so that when they bloomed, they would create areas of intense color, solid blocks that the eye could rest on. This was intentional. Everything was intentional. The garden was not decoration. It was not an afterthought. It was a composition. It was something he was building with the same attention he brought to painting, the same consideration of how elements worked together, how colors influenced each other, how the whole thing needed to function as a unified experience. He worked in the garden himself. He did not simply direct others. He dug. He planted. He moved earth. He got his hands dirty. This was not the work of a gentleman overseeing staff. This was the work of someone who needed to understand exactly how things were arranged, who needed to know the garden through the physical act of making it. The work was repetitive. Day after day, the same kinds of tasks. Preparing soil, planting bulbs, watering, watching, waiting, adjusting, moving something that was not quite right. Trying again. The garden required patience in a way that painting did not. You could not rush a plant. You could not force it to grow faster or bloom earlier. You had to work within its rhythms, accept its pace, trust that what you planted would eventually become what you envisioned. This discipline suited him. He had learned patience through painting, through the long hours of observation, the willingness to return to the same subject again and again. Now he was applying that same patience to the garden. He was learning to wait, to tend, to trust the slow process of growth. Over time, the garden began to take shape. Visitors would arrive and see what Monet was doing. They would notice how the colors were arranged, how certain flowers seemed to glow next to others, how the garden had a rhythm to it. Monet had planned a flowering calendar. He wanted the garden to move through the year in waves of color. In April, there would be tulips, pansies, narcissi. In May, the irises would bloom. The peonies. The wisteria would drape itself over structures. Azaleas would add their colors. Daisies and delphiniums would follow. Each month brought its own arrangement. The garden was never static. It was always becoming something else. And Monet watched these transitions carefully. He learned what bloomed when. He learned how to arrange plantings so that there was always something in flower. The children were part of this. They had grown older since arriving in Giverny. They were no longer quite so young. They helped in the garden. They carried things. They learned the names of plants. They understood, even if they could not articulate it, that the garden mattered to Monet in a way that went beyond simple beauty. It was connected to his work. It was part of how he saw the world. Alice remained the steady center of the household. While Monet worked in the garden, while he became absorbed in the problems of color and composition, Alice kept everything functioning. She managed the meals. She managed the children. She made sure the house ran smoothly. She walked through the garden sometimes, not to work in it the way Monet did, but simply to be there, to see what was blooming. The garden was shared space. It belonged to all of them, in the sense that they lived with it, moved through it, saw it every day. The act of gardening became part of the daily rhythm. Monet would rise at dawn, as he always did. After his cold bath, after his glass of white wine, he would go out, sometimes to paint, sometimes to the garden. The two activities were connected. Sometimes he would work in the garden in the early morning, when the light was still soft, before the heat of the day. Other times he would go to the garden in the afternoon, after painting, to check on what needed attention. There was something meditative about the work. The repetitive actions. The slow progress. The way you could lose yourself in small tasks. Weeding. Deadheading spent blooms. Adjusting stakes. Tying back plants that were growing too vigorously. These tasks did not require the same intensity as painting, but they required attention. They required you to look closely, to notice, to care. Monet cared deeply about the garden. He was particular about how things should be. If something was not right, he would change it. He would move a plant to a different location if he decided it was not working where it was. He would try different combinations of flowers to see how colors interacted. He would experiment with height and density, with creating layers of plants so that the garden had depth, so that you could look into it rather than just at it. The garden became a place where he had control. In painting, he was always responding to conditions he could not change. The light moved. The weather shifted. But in the garden, he could shape things. He could decide what would grow where. He could create the conditions he wanted to paint. This was not about domination. It was about relationship. The garden still had its own life. Plants grew according to their nature. But within those constraints, Monet could work. He could arrange. He could compose. The flowers he chose were not rare or exotic. They were common flowers, many of them. Things that grew well in Normandy. Things that were reliable. Irises. Peonies. Roses. Nasturtiums. Sunflowers. Daisies. He was not interested in novelty or rarity. He was interested in color. In how colors worked together. In creating masses of bloom that would give him the intensity he wanted. He planted German bearded irises in dense stands, not scattered through the garden, but concentrated. When they bloomed, they created areas of deep blue and purple, solid zones of color that anchored the space. He planted nasturtiums that would spill over paths, their orange and yellow flowers creating bright ribbons that connected different parts of the garden. He planted dahlias and sunflowers in groups, understanding that the impact came from repetition, from seeing the same flower many times, from the way your eye could move through a mass of color, rather than jumping from one isolated plant to another. This was composition. This was the same thinking he brought to painting. how elements related to each other, how colors influenced each other, how the whole needed to work together. The garden was becoming a living canvas, something that changed with time, with light, with season, but that still maintained the underlying structure he had given it. He did not think of the garden as separate from his painting. They were connected. The garden gave him subjects. It gave him controlled conditions. It gave him the opportunity to study color relationships over long periods of time. And he painted it. He would set up his easel in the garden and paint what he had planted.
He would paint the same section at different times of day, watching how the light changed everything.
The flowers he had arranged became his subjects. The garden he had built with his own hands became the world he painted. This was a different kind of work than painting the coast or the Seine. When he painted the garden, he was painting something he had made. He was painting his own vision made physical. The garden was both subject and creation. Alice understood this. She saw how the garden mattered to him. She saw how it gave him something painting alone could not. A sense of making something that would persist. Something that would grow and change over years. Paintings were finished, eventually. But the garden was never finished. It was always becoming. The children played in the garden, but they also learned to respect it. They understood which areas they could run through and which areas they should avoid. They learned not to pick flowers without asking. They learned that the garden was not just a place to play, but a place where their father worked, where he thought, where he made something that was important to him in ways they were beginning to understand. As the garden developed, as it became more complex and more intentional, Monet's relationship to it deepened. He was not just arranging flowers. He was building a world. He was creating an environment that would support his work for years to come. He was investing in something that required patience and faith. The faith that what he planted now would become what he envisioned. That the slow work of tending would pay off in color and form and light. The routines of the household continued around this work. Meals at their appointed times. The children growing older. Alice managing everything. The house functioning. But the garden was growing too. It was becoming denser. More layered. More considered. It was becoming the place where Monet's vision of color could exist, not just on canvas, but in the world. He stood in the garden sometimes, not working, not painting, just looking, seeing what he had made, noticing what was blooming, observing how the light fell on different plants at different times of day. This quiet observation was part of the work. It was how he learned what to do next. Where to plant more of something. Where to remove something that was not working. How to adjust the composition so that it came closer to what he saw in his mind. The garden was teaching him patience in new ways. A painting could be finished in days or weeks. The garden took years. Some plants would not reach maturity for several seasons. Some combinations would not reveal themselves until enough time had passed. He had to trust the process. He had to accept that he would not see the full result of his work immediately. that some of what he was doing now was for future years, for a garden that did not yet exist, but that would exist if he kept tending, kept planting, kept adjusting. This was devotion, quiet devotion. The daily return to the same tasks, the willingness to do small things repeatedly, to pull weeds, to deadhead flowers, to water in dry weather, to protect tender plants in winter, to plan for the next season, to think ahead while remaining present with what was happening now. The garden began to feel essential, not just to Monet's work, but to the life of the household. It was where they gathered sometimes in the evening, where the children played, where Alice walked, where visitors came to see what Monet was creating. It was shared space, but it was also deeply personal. It reflected Monet's way of seeing, his understanding of color, his patience, his willingness to work slowly towards something that might take years to fully realize. And as the garden grew, as it became more established, Monet began to think about what else it might become. The flowers were beautiful. The compositions were working. The color moved through the seasons the way he had hoped. But there was something else he wanted. Something that would require more work, more patience, more faith in the slow process of making. He began to think about water. Monet wanted water. The flower garden had given him color, had given him subjects he could control and observe through every season. But there was something else he needed. He wanted a surface that would hold light differently. He wanted reflection. There was land adjacent to his property. It included a small stream, a tributary that ran through quietly, following the contours of the landscape. Monet bought the land. This required money. It required believing that what he envisioned was worth the work. But he had been living in Giverny for years. The house was established. The flower garden was mature. He knew he would stay. He began to change the land. The stream needed to be diverted. Water did not naturally pool where he wanted the pond. It flowed and would continue to flow unless he changed its course. This required understanding how water moved, how to redirect it while working with its nature. The work was physical. Men came to help. They dug. They moved earth. They built small dams and channels. Monet supervised. He made decisions about where the pond should be, how large, what shape. This was not just about digging a hole. This was about creating a space that would function visually. Slowly, the pond began to exist. At first, it was just excavated earth. Mud, unformed. But as the water filled it, as the level rose, it began to take on character. It became a surface, a boundary between air and depth, a place where light could rest and also penetrate, where the sky could appear below as well as above. Monet planted water lilies. He chose them carefully. Different varieties, colors that would work together. White lilies, pink, yellow, He wanted them to float on the surface, to create forms that would rest there without covering everything, that would leave space for reflection, for the play of light on water. The lilies needed time to establish themselves. They did not bloom immediately. They needed to root, to spread, to become comfortable in their new environment. He waited. While he waited, he thought about what else the pond needed. He wanted a bridge. Not a simple bridge. Not a purely functional structure that would merely allow crossing from one bank to another. He wanted something that would be part of the composition, that would frame the pond, that would create a threshold, a way of entering the space of the water garden that would be both practical and beautiful. He had been collecting Japanese prints for years. More than 200 of them. Works by Utamaro, Hokusai, Hiroshige. He studied these prints. He looked at how Japanese artists composed landscapes, how they used curved lines, how they created spaces that felt both natural and arranged, how bridges appeared in their work, arched and elegant, structures that did not dominate but harmonized with their surroundings. He wanted something like that. He designed a bridge that would curve over the pond. An arched bridge, painted green, with railings that would echo the curves of the arch. It would cross the narrow part of the pond, creating a focal point, a structure that the eye would find and return to. It would be surrounded by plants. Wisteria would grow over it. The curved banks of the pond would lead toward it and away from it, creating rhythms that would guide the eye through the space. The bridge was built. It was painted. It was positioned exactly where Monet wanted it. And once it was there, the water garden began to feel complete. Not finished, because a garden is never finished, but complete in the sense that all the essential elements were present. Water, plants, reflection, structure. The curved bridge became a threshold between the ordinary world and this other space he had created. The household watched this transformation. The children were older now, some of them nearly grown. They had been part of Giverny for years, had watched the flower garden develop, and now they watched as this new project took shape. They walked to the pond. They crossed the bridge. They understood that this mattered to their father in a way that was different from anything else. This was not just a garden. This was something he was building to paint. This was his subject, made physical. Alice continued to manage everything practical. The meals, the household accounts, the daily functioning of a house with many people. While Monet became increasingly absorbed in the water garden, while he spent hours there observing the light on the pond, the way the lilies moved in slight breezes, the way reflections formed and dissolved, Alice kept the structure of their life intact. She did not need to understand why the pond mattered so much. She only needed to support the conditions that allowed Monet to work. And she did. Monet began to spend more time at the pond than in the flower garden. The flowers still bloomed. They still moved through their seasonal cycles. But the pond offered something different. It offered change that was more subtle, more continuous. The flowers changed slowly, over weeks. But the pond changed constantly. from hour to hour, from minute to minute. The quality of light on water was never the same twice. He would stand at the edge of the pond and look, not always painting, sometimes just looking, learning what the pond could show him, how the surface worked, how reflections appeared, how clouds moving across the sky appeared in the water below, creating two skies, one above and one inverted, both present at once. The surface of the pond was a mirror, but not a simple mirror. It was affected by wind, by the movement of water, by lily pads that interrupted the reflection, made the surface something complex. Depth was visible, but not always clear. You could see plants growing below the surface. You could see the stems of water lilies descending, but you could not see all the way down. The pond held things that could not be fully seen. This relationship between surface and depth interested Monet. The pond showed you the sky and also what lay beneath. It was transparent and opaque simultaneously. It reflected and revealed. The Japanese bridge created a frame. When you looked at the pond from certain angles, the bridge was there, curved above the water, creating a shape that echoed in its reflection below. The arch above and the arch in the water formed a kind of circle, incomplete but suggested. This was the influence of the Japanese prints. The way they used curved forms. The way they created compositions that felt balanced without being symmetrical. Monet was not trying to make a Japanese garden. He was in Normandy. The plants were Norman plants, adapted to Norman weather. But he was borrowing ideas about composition, about how to arrange elements, so that they created a sense of harmony, of different parts working together to form a unified whole. Later, he would say that he felt he was living in Japan, but in Normandy. The garden was his, but it carried influences from the prints he had studied so carefully. The pond became the center of his attention. He had created it, had shaped every aspect of it, and now it was teaching him. It was showing him things he had not anticipated. The way light moved across water. The way reflection could be more interesting than the thing being reflected. The way a pond could feel like an interior space, even though it was outdoors, open to the sky. The curved banks helped create this feeling. They enclosed the water without confining it. They created a sense of being inside something, of having entered a space that was distinct from the surrounding landscape. The bridge reinforced this. It was a threshold. You crossed it to enter the water garden. You crossed it to leave. It marked the boundary between this space and the other parts of the property. Monet painted the bridge. He painted it many times, from different angles, at different times of day, in different seasons. The bridge in summer, with wisteria blooming above it. The bridge in autumn, reflected in water that held the colors of changing leaves. The bridge in spring, when everything was fresh and new. The bridge in winter, when the pond was still and the air was cold and clear. Each time he painted it, he was painting the same thing and also something entirely different. The bridge did not change. but everything around it changed. The light changed. The reflections changed. The colors in the water changed. The presence or absence of lilies changed. And so each painting was a record of a particular moment, a particular set of conditions that would never repeat exactly. This was what the pond offered him. Endless variation within a consistent structure. The same subject, infinitely different. He did not need to travel to find new things to paint. He could stay here, at this pond he had made, and paint it for years, and never paint the same thing twice. The water lilies began to bloom. White flowers opening on the surface. Pink flowers. Yellow. They floated. They moved slightly with the water. They were rooted below, but appeared to rest freely on the surface, as if they were not attached to anything, as if they were simply present, simply there, floating between sky and depth. Monet observed them carefully. He watched how they opened in morning light, how they closed as evening came, how they moved in response to wind, to ripples in the water, to the presence of insects and small creatures. They were not static. They were alive. They were part of the pond's constant motion, its continuous becoming. The household continued in the background. Meals at their appointed times. The children moving through their days. Alice ensuring everything functioned. The house with its pink walls and green shutters standing solid behind the gardens. Life went on in its rhythms, while Monet stood at the pond, looking, painting, learning what this surface could teach him. He had created something that was both natural and constructed. The pond was not a natural formation. It existed because he had made it exist. The water was diverted. The banks were shaped. The plants were chosen and positioned. And yet it felt natural. It felt like it belonged there.
It felt like it had always been there, even though he remembered clearly when it had not existed,
when there had only been ground and a stream passing through. This was the achievement of the water garden. It was made, but did not feel made. It was arranged, but did not feel forced. It had the quality of something discovered rather than something built. And yet, Monet knew every decision that had gone into it. He had shaped every aspect. He had determined where the water would rest, where the bridge would stand, where the lilies would grow. The pond settled into the landscape. The plants established themselves. The ecosystem began to develop its own life. Small creatures came. Frogs. Insects. Birds at the water's edge. The pond became alive, connected to the weather, to the seasons, to the cycles moving through the place. And Monet continued to look at it. Day after day. The pond became the subject he would return to more than any other. A subject that was endlessly complex. That offered new observations every time he approached it. He would paint the pond hundreds of times. He would paint the water lilies until they became almost an obsession. He would paint the reflections, the surface, the depth, the light, the color, the movement. He would paint the same view over and over, watching how it changed, learning what it could show him, understanding that he would never exhaust it, that there would always be more to see. But that work was still ahead. For now, the pond was new. The lilies were just beginning to spread. The bridge stood fresh and clean. The water was clear. Everything was beginning. He stood at the edge and looked at what he had made, at the surface that held sky and depth together, at the curved bridge creating its threshold, at the water lilies floating between reflection and root, at this space that felt interior even though it was open to the air. He had wanted water, and now he had it. Now he could begin to understand what it would teach him. Monet began to paint the same thing many times. This was not repetition in the ordinary sense. It was about understanding that a subject was not one thing, but many things. That what you saw depended entirely on when you looked. That a haystack in morning light was fundamentally different from the same haystack at noon or at sunset. He painted haystacks, common agricultural structures, stacks of grain left in fields after harvest. They were ordinary objects, functional, part of the rural landscape around Giverny. But Monet saw something in them. He saw how they held light, how their simple forms became screens for the atmosphere around them, how the same stack could appear golden or violet or orange or blue depending on the hour, the weather, the season. The haystack did not change, but everything around it changed. He would go to the fields with multiple canvases. Not one. Many. Sometimes a dozen or more. He would set them up in a row and work on them in sequence, moving from one to the next as the light changed. Morning light on one canvas. Mid-morning on another. Noon on a third. Afternoon. Late afternoon. Evening. Each canvas capturing a specific moment, a specific quality of atmosphere. This required discipline. The light moved quickly. A particular effect might last only 20 minutes, maybe 30. You could not deliberate. You could not spend an hour considering one passage. You had to work rapidly, decisively, trusting your eye and your hand to catch what was there before it passed. And then you had to stop, set that canvas aside, and move to the next one, because the light had changed, and what you were seeing now needed its own canvas, its own record. He would return to the same field day after day. The haystacks did not move. They stood where they had been placed. But he would paint them over and over, at different times, in different conditions. He was learning what they could show him, how many different ways a simple form could appear, how endlessly variable light was, how the atmosphere itself was the real subject, not the object it surrounded. The household continued in its rhythms. Meals at 11:30 and 7. The children growing older. Monet's sons were young men now. They had their own lives, their own concerns. But they still lived in the orbit of Giverny, still understood that their father's work required space and time, and a kind of respect for what he was attempting. Alice managed everything that needed managing. She knew when Monet was working on a series. She knew it meant he would be gone for hours, that he would return tired, sometimes frustrated, sometimes satisfied, but always absorbed, in what he had been trying to do. She made sure the household functioned around this work, made sure there was food, that the house was maintained, that daily life continued steadily, while Monet pursued something that required total attention. After the haystacks, there were poplars, trees along the river Epta, tall, slender trees planted in rows. They were meant to be harvested for timber. They were commercial plantings, not decorative. But Monet saw them and knew he needed to paint them. He saw how they stood against the sky, how their vertical forms created rhythms, how light moved through their leaves, how they reflected in the water below. He learned that the trees were scheduled to be cut down. He could not accept this, not while he was still painting them. He needed them to remain. So he made an arrangement with the landowner. He would pay to delay the harvest. The trees would stand until he finished his series. This was how much the work mattered to him. He would pay to keep a subject in existence long enough to complete his observation of it. He painted the poplars in different seasons, in different weather, at different times of day. The same vertical rhythms appearing in canvas after canvas, but always different in color, in atmosphere, in the quality of light that surrounded them. The trees stood still while the world around them changed endlessly. Then there was Rouen Cathedral. He rented a room across from it, a room with a window that looked directly at the cathedral's facade. He set up multiple canvases and painted the stone surface as light moved across it. Morning light, making the stone appear one color. Afternoon light, revealing different tones. Evening light, changing everything again. The cathedral did not move. Stone did not change, but the light transformed it hour by hour. The same architectural forms became different colors. Gray became blue, became violet, became gold, became pink. The shadows shifted. The sense of depth changed. What had been flat became dimensional. What had been dimensional flattened out. All of this happened because of light, because of atmosphere, because of the continuous motion of the sun across the sky, and the endless variation of weather and air. Monet would work on many canvases in a single session. He would start one at dawn. Work on it for 30 minutes. Set it aside as the light changed. Pick up another canvas that corresponded to the new conditions. Work on that. Set it aside. Move to the next. Hour after hour, moving through canvases, each one capturing a specific moment, a specific quality that would never repeat exactly. This was not about finishing paintings quickly. It was about building up observations over time. He would return to these canvases later, in the studio, and work on them further. But the foundation had to be laid in the moment, while the light was actually happening. You could not invent it later. You could not remember it accurately enough. You had to be there, looking, responding, setting it down while it was present. The discipline was immense. It required stamina. It required the ability to sustain concentration for hours. It required believing that this method, this way of approaching a subject, was worth the effort. That painting the same thing 30 times was not wasteful, but necessary. that each canvas held something unique, something that could not be captured any other way. People did not always understand what he was doing. They would see the series and wonder why he painted the same haystack or the same trees or the same cathedral so many times. But Monet was not repeating anything. He was documenting change. He was showing that identity is not fixed but fluid, that what something is depends entirely on the conditions in which we encounter it. He was painting time. He was painting atmosphere. He was painting the air between himself and his subject. He was painting light as it moved through space, as it created color relationships that lasted only minutes before dissolving into something else. The work was solitary. He would be in the fields alone, or in the rented room alone, moving between canvases, working steadily. This required being alone with what you were seeing, alone with the problem of how to set it down. He was becoming increasingly inward. Not withdrawn, exactly. He still lived with his family. But his attention was focused on the work in a way that left less room for other things. The work required everything. It required his willingness to return again and again to the same subjects, to keep looking when it seemed there was nothing new to see. But there was always something new to see. The world was not stable. Light was not constant. Everything was in motion, everything was changing. Back in Giverny, the water garden was maturing. The water lilies were spreading. The bridge stood solid over the pond. The whole space was settling into itself, becoming what it would be. Monet would walk there in the evenings, after working elsewhere. He would look at the pond. He would see how it changed from hour to hour, just as the haystacks changed, just as the poplars changed, just as the cathedral changed. The pond was always different. The reflections were never the same twice. The position of the lily pads shifted slightly. The quality of light on the water moved through endless variations. Morning light. Afternoon light. Evening light. Overcast light. Bright light. Soft light. Each condition creating a different pond, a different arrangement of color and reflection and depth. He began to understand that the pond could be a subject, the way the haystacks had been a subject, the way the poplars had been, the way the cathedral had been. But it was also more than that. It was his subject. It was something he had made. It was not just something he had found in the world and chosen to paint. It was something he had built specifically to paint. It was his creation and his subject simultaneously. This realization was gradual. It was not a sudden decision. It was more like understanding slowly accumulating, the recognition that he had spent years building something that could occupy him for whatever time remained, that the water garden could give him what he needed, that it could be the place where all his thinking about light and color and atmosphere could find its ultimate expression. The household knew the garden mattered to him. They had watched him create it. But they may not have understood yet that it was becoming central to his work in a way that went beyond anything else. That it was not just a garden, but a place where he could conduct endless experiments with observation. The series paintings had taught him how to look at one thing many times, how to sustain attention. The haystacks, the poplars, the cathedral, these had been preparation. Because now he had a subject that would not be harvested. That would not change location. A subject that was entirely under his control, that he could tend and observe for as long as he lived. A subject that was always present, always available, always offering something new. The water garden was waiting. The pond was there. The lilies were spreading. The reflections were shifting. And Monet was ready. He had learned how to paint in series. He had learned how to observe one thing many times. Now he could apply everything he had learned to the place he had built, to the pond that was his, to the water that reflected sky and depth, to the bridge that curved over it all. The water garden would become the ultimate subject, not because it was more beautiful than other subjects, but because it was his, because he had shaped it, because he could observe it endlessly without leaving home, because it offered everything he needed: light, reflection, color, atmosphere, change. He had been working toward this for years without knowing it. It had all been leading here, to a place where he could stand and paint what he saw, over and over, measuring time in color, watching light move across water. Monet stood at the edge of the pond and painted water. Not the things in the water. Not the lilies themselves, exactly, though they were there, floating. Not the bridge, though sometimes it appeared at the edge. Not the banks. He painted water. He painted the surface that held everything else. He painted reflection and depth simultaneously. He painted what happened when sky met pond. There was no horizon in these paintings. No clear boundary between earth and air. Just water. Just surface. Just the endless meeting of what was above and what was below, held together in a plane that was neither entirely one nor the other. The sky appeared in the pond. Clouds moved across the water without moving through it. Trees stood inverted below their own branches. The world doubled itself, created a mirror image that shifted with the slightest disturbance of the water, that dissolved and reformed continuously. Monet painted this. He painted the moment when you could not tell what was reflection and what was actual, when sky and water became one surface, when depth disappeared into flatness. He set up his easel at the pond's edge. Sometimes he worked from the Japanese bridge. Sometimes he stood on the bank. Sometimes he worked from a small boat, surrounded by water and lilies, the banks distant. He painted the same view over and over. The pond at different times of day. The pond in different seasons. The pond in different weather. The reflections changing with every shift in light, every movement of cloud, every breath of wind. Each painting was different. The composition might seem similar. The elements were the same. Water. Lilies. Reflection. But the color relationships changed completely depending on conditions. Morning light, made the water cool, blue and violet. Afternoon light warmed it, brought greens and golds. Evening light turned it pink and orange. Overcast light softened everything, removed shadows, created a diffuse quality where nothing was quite solid. This was what he was painting. Not objects, but conditions. Not things, but the way things appeared under specific circumstances. Not the world, but his experience of the world in a particular moment that would never repeat exactly. The seasons marked themselves through color. Spring brought fresh greens. The water reflected new leaves, young growth, the pale, clear light of early in the year. Summer deepened everything. The greens became richer. The reflections became more complex. The lilies bloomed in their sequence. White flowers first, then pink, then yellow. Each flower lasting a brief time before fading, before being replaced by another. Autumn changed the palette. The reflections in the water shifted toward copper and rust as leaves turned. The light became lower, more angled. The shadows grew longer. Everything took on a warmer tone, a sense of the year moving toward its close. Winter stripped away the flowers. The water became darker. The reflections starker. The pond in winter was a different pond, colder, quieter, holding different light. Monet painted through all of this, year after year. The same pond, the same water lilies, the same reflections, endlessly varying. He was not trying to capture the pond once and perfectly. He was documenting its continuous transformation. He was recording how it moved through time, how it responded to light, how it never held still, even when nothing in it actually moved. The household continued around this work. The routines remained. Meals at their appointed times. The house functioning. But everything was quieter now. The children were grown. Some had left. Some remained nearby. The house that had once been full of young people was emptier. Voices did not fill it the way they once had. Monet was aging. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But time was passing. His hair had gone white years ago. His beard was white. His hands showed the years of work. He moved a bit more slowly. He tired more easily. But he still rose at dawn. He still took his cold bath. He still went to the pond and painted. Alice was still there. Still managing the household. Still ensuring everything worked. She was older too. They both were, but the relationship between them remained what it had always been. She provided the stability that allowed him to work. She kept the practical world functioning while he focused on painting. She understood, without needing to articulate it, that the work was what mattered most, that everything else was in service of allowing the work to continue. She walked through the garden sometimes. Less often now. But she would still come to see what was blooming, what had changed. She would cross the Japanese bridge and look at the pond. She would see what Monet saw, though perhaps differently. She would see the surface and the reflection, and the lilies floating between them. And she would go back to the house, back to whatever needed her attention. Time was passing in subtle ways. Not through dramatic events, but through accumulation. Through the slow changes that happen when years build on years. The pond was the same pond. The garden was the same garden. But they were also older, more established, more themselves. The lilies had spread further. The plants around the pond had matured. Everything was more complete, more settled. And Monet kept painting. He painted the edges dissolving. He painted the point where water met sky, and you could not tell which was which. He painted reflections that seemed more real than what they reflected. He painted depth that appeared as surface. He painted surface that suggested depth. He painted the confusion of perception that happens when you look at water long enough, when you stop trying to separate what is from what appears to be, and simply accept that both exist simultaneously. The paintings became less about description and more about experience. They did not try to show you what the pond looked like. They tried to convey what it felt like to stand there, to look at the water, to see reflections and lilies and light all merging together. They showed not what was seen, but what was experienced when seeing happened. Monet's focus was narrowing. He was not painting haystacks anymore. He was not painting the cathedral. He was not even painting the flower garden as often. He was painting the pond. Just the pond. Day after day. The same subject that was never the same. Some might have found this limiting. To paint the same thing over and over. But for Monet, it was the opposite. It meant he could go as deep as he needed to go. He could observe with a level of attention that would not be possible if he kept moving to new subjects. The paintings grew larger. He was working on bigger canvases now. Large enough that they surrounded you, that they created their own space. When you stood in front of one, you did not look at it so much as enter it. This was intentional. Monet was trying to create experiences. He was trying to make you feel what he felt when he stood at the pond. The sense of being surrounded by light. The sense of surface and depth existing simultaneously. The sense of time suspended. The work was becoming more abstract, though he did not think of it that way. The lilies were still recognizable as lilies. The water was still recognizable as water. But the relationships between elements were becoming more complex, less literal. The reflections were not always clearly reflections. The surface was not always clearly surface. Everything was bleeding together, merging, creating fields of color that suggested reality rather than depicted it directly. He was painting what he saw, but what he saw was not what others saw. He had spent so many years looking at this pond, had observed it so thoroughly that his perception had changed. He saw relationships others would miss. He saw color shifts that lasted only moments. He saw the way light could transform everything in the space of minutes. He saw patterns in the seeming randomness of lily pad placement. He saw order in what appeared chaotic. And he painted this. He painted his seeing. He painted what happened in his eyes and his mind when he stood at the pond's edge and looked. The paintings became records of consciousness, documents of perception, evidence that looking was not simple, that it required training, patience, sustained attention, the willingness to see what was actually there rather than what you expected to see. The routine of the work was meditative. The daily return to the pond, the setting up of the easel, the preparation of paints, the long hours of looking and painting and looking again, the slow accumulation of marks that would eventually become a painting, the knowledge that tomorrow he would return and do it again, and the day after, and the day after that. There was comfort in this repetition, in knowing that the subject would be there, that the pond would not disappear, that he could return as many times as he needed to, that the work had no endpoint except the one that would be determined by time and his ability to continue, that he could paint water lilies for the rest of his life and never run out of things to see, things to record, moments that needed capturing. The light moved across the pond. Clouds passed overhead and appeared below. The lilies opened and closed with the rhythms of their nature. The water held everything in its surface, reflected everything, absorbed everything, became a scream for the world above, while maintaining its own depth below. Monet painted. He painted the meeting of surface and depth. He painted reflection as reality. He painted color as experience. He painted light as substance. He painted water as air. He painted the pond not as a place, but as a state of being, a condition of perception, a moment extended beyond time. The household was quiet. The garden was mature. The years were passing. Alice was there. The meals happened when they were supposed to happen. The house stood with its pink walls and green shutters. The bridge curved over the pond. The lilies spread across the surface. And Monet stood at the edge and painted. Painted the same thing that was never the same. Painted water that held sky. Painted reflections that were more real than what they reflected. Painted the world dissolving into light and color and surface. Painted what it felt like to stand in one place and look, really look, at what was there. Time suspended over water. The pond holding everything. The lilies floating. The reflections shimmering. The light moving. The colors shifting. The surface blending with depth. The sky appearing below. The world inverted and upright simultaneously. This was what he painted. This was what occupied him. This was what the years of work had been leading toward. Not a single perfect image, but an ongoing practice. Not completion, but continuation. Not finishing, but returning. Again and again and again. The pond was always there. The water was always changing. The light was always moving. And Monet was there too, with his easel and his paints and his practiced eye, watching, recording, translating what he saw into marks on canvas, building up surfaces that would hold, for a moment, the experience of standing at the edge of water and seeing the world reflected there. Monet rose at dawn, as he had always done. The routine had not changed in decades. The cold bath, the glass of white wine, the quiet house before the household began to stir. These things remained constant, markers of time that repeated so reliably, they became part of the structure of his days. But something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. It was more like settling. Like the feeling of something finding its place. He was not traveling as much anymore. The excursions away from Giverny had become less frequent. The garden was enough. It gave him everything he needed. Every morning brought new conditions. Every season brought new color relationships. He did not need to go elsewhere to find subjects. The subject was here, and now he understood that he could spend whatever time remained simply observing it, simply being present with it. He would walk to the pond in the early morning. The light at that hour was particular. Cool, fresh. The air still held the night's temperature. The water was often still, not yet disturbed by wind or the activity of the day. The reflections were clearest then. The sky appeared in the pond with unusual clarity. The lilies floated in perfect stillness. He would stand there for a while before beginning to paint. Just looking, letting his eyes adjust, letting himself become present with the space. This was part of the work. The looking that happened before the painting, the attention that prepared the way for the marks that would come later. Then he would set up his easel, arrange his paints, begin the slow process of mixing colors, of finding the relationships that would approximate what he was seeing. The green of the lily pads, the blue of the water, the pink of the morning sky reflected below, the white of the flowers, the darker tones that suggested depth. He worked slowly now. Not because he had lost his speed, but because the work itself had slowed. It had become more meditative, more about being present with the subject than about capturing it quickly. He was not racing against changing light in the same way he had when painting the haystacks or the cathedral. He was here. The pond was here. They would both be here tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that. The garden had become both home and studio. He did not have to leave it to work. He did not have to pack materials and travel. He could walk from his house to the pond in minutes. Could work for a few hours and return for lunch at 11:30. Could go back in the afternoon if the light was interesting. Could stand at the same spot he had stood yesterday and the day before, seeing it differently each time, understanding more each time. This was the life that had steadied. The constant movement of his earlier years had resolved into this. A house with pink walls and green shutters. A garden that bloomed in sequence through the seasons. A pond that held reflections. A bridge that curved over water. And the daily practice of going there, looking, painting. Alice was still beside him, not physically present while he painted, but present in the life they had built together. She was in the house when he returned. She managed the meals, the household, the practical concerns that allowed everything else to function. She had been doing this for so many years now that it was simply the shape their life had taken. He painted. She maintained the structure that made painting possible. The children were adults now. Some lived nearby. Some had moved away. They visited. They wrote letters. They had their own lives, their own concerns. But they knew where home was. The pink house in Giverny. The garden their father had built. The pond he painted endlessly. This was the center they could return to. The place that remained constant while their own lives changed and developed. The house held all the years they had lived there together. The rooms Alice had arranged. The blue sitting room where they had gathered. The yellow dining room where they had shared meals. The walls that Monet had chosen colors for. The spaces that had been shaped by daily use, by repetition, by the accumulation of ordinary moments that made up a life. Monet worked in the garden every day. Not just painting, also tending. He still cared about how the garden looked. He still made decisions about what should be planted where. The garden was not just his subject. It was his creation. He maintained it. He shaped it. By this time, he employed gardeners. Several of them. One gardener worked from a small, flat-bottomed boat. His sole task was cleaning the pond surface, removing leaves, clearing debris, even washing the water lilies themselves so they would be clean for painting. The head gardener was Felix Bruy. He understood what Monet wanted. He knew how the garden should look. Monet would consult with Bruy about plantings. It was a collaboration, though Monet made the final decisions. The days had a rhythm. Morning light. Painting at the pond. Return for lunch. Plum brandy aperitif. The meal with Alice. Afternoon rest or more work in the garden. Dinner at 7. Evening quiet. The routine repeated so reliably, it became nearly invisible. It was simply how time moved. But within this routine, there was infinite variation. Each morning was different. Each time at the pond revealed something new. The constancy of the schedule held space for the constant change of the subject. The garden was the same garden, but it was never the same. It was always becoming something else. Always moving through its cycles. Always offering new observations. Monet was entering the world he had created. Not just physically walking into the garden, but inhabiting it completely. Understanding it at a level that came only from sustained attention over many years. He knew when the wisteria would bloom. He knew how the light moved across the pond at different times of year. He knew which lily pads would catch the morning sun. He knew the garden's moods, its qualities, its endless small variations. This knowledge was not intellectual. It was physical. It came from being there, from looking day after day, from painting what he saw and then looking again and seeing something different, from the slow accumulation of observation that built into deep familiarity. He knew the garden the way you know your own home, not by thinking about it, but by living in it. The paintings continued, canvas after canvas. Water lilies, reflections, the bridge, the pond in different light, the pond in different seasons, the same elements arranged and rearranged by the endless variation of atmospheric conditions. Each painting was complete in itself. Each was also part of an ongoing investigation that had no endpoint except the one that time would eventually impose. But he was not thinking about endpoints. He was thinking about today, about this morning's light, about how the pond looked right now, about the particular quality of blue in the water, about the way the lily pads created a pattern across the surface, about the reflection of clouds, about the air between himself and what he was painting. This was presence. Not thinking about past or future, not planning or remembering, just being here, with the pond, with the paint, with the act of translating what he saw into marks on canvas. Just the continuous present of looking and responding, of seeing and recording, of being alive in the moment and attending to what was there. Alice walked through the garden in the late afternoon sometimes. She would see Monet at work, see him standing at his easel, looking at the pond, mixing colors, applying paint. She would not disturb him. She would simply pass through, perhaps pausing to look at the same view he was painting, seeing it through her own eyes, her own experience of this place they had lived in for so long. They had been together for many years now, had built this life together, had raised children together, had watched the garden grow from bare ground to what it was now, had seen the pond fill, the lilies spread, the bridge age into its surroundings. They had shared all of this. And they continued to share it in the quiet way of people who have been together long enough that they do not need to speak to understand each other. The seasons moved. Spring came, and the garden renewed itself. Tulips and narcissi and pansies. The fresh greens of new growth. The cool light of early year. Summer followed with its deeper colors, its longer days, its full bloom. Autumn brought warmth and change, leaves turning, light slanting lower. Winter stripped things back, revealed structure, offered its own stark beauty. Monet painted through all of it. Through every season. Through every change. Through the garden's continuous transformation. He was not trying to finish. He was simply continuing to look, continuing to paint, continuing to be present with what was in front of him. The garden would remain. The pond would continue to hold reflections. The lilies would bloom and fade and bloom again. The bridge would stand over the water. The seasons would turn. And Monet would continue to return to it, morning after morning, year after year, for as long as he was able. This was what the years of work had created. Not a final statement, not a conclusion, but a practice, a way of being, A relationship with a place that would continue, that would deepen, that would reveal new things as long as attention was brought to it. He stood at the pond's edge in the early light. The water was still. The sky appeared below. The lilies floated. The garden surrounded him. This place he had made. This world he had shaped. This subject that was inexhaustible. He picked up his brush. He mixed paint. He looked at what was before him. And he began again. And so the days continued. Morning light on the pond. Reflections forming and dissolving. Lilies opening and closing in their quiet rhythm. The house stood behind the garden, steady. The bridge curved over the water. The seasons turned. Monet returned to the same place again and again. Not searching now. Not moving from town to town. But remaining. He had built a world he did not need to leave. And yet, time was still moving. The garden matured. The house grew quieter. The years gathered gently, without announcement. In our next episode, we will stay in Giverny. We will not rush forward. We will not arrive at an ending. Instead, we will look at what it means to return to familiar landscapes, to work that deepens rather than changes, to a life that continues without dramatic turning points. If you have found calm in these moments, you're welcome to subscribe and continue with the series. You may also share a quiet thought in the comments below. I'm grateful for the presence of this community. For now, the pond remains. The light moves across the surface. And Monet returns to his easel once more.